Howdy everyone, I'm going to be doing a Declaim and Explain video on Anne Bradstreet's in memory of my dear grandchild Elizabeth Bradstreet, who deceased August 1665, being a year and a half old. I'll start by reading the first stanza, and then I'll say a little bit about what's happening, and then finish out the poem, and then we'll talk about different tropes, meter, all the good stuff. Alright. Farewell, dear babe, my heart's too much content. Farewell, sweet babe, the pleasure of mine eye. Farewell, fair flower, that for a space was lent, then ta'en away unto eternity. Blessed babe, why should I once bewail thy fate, or sigh the days so soon were terminate, sith thou art settled in an everlasting state. So, even without the title, you can tell from this first stanza, the first 7 lines, that obviously Bradstreet, or the speaker of this poem, is dealing with a loss of some sort, a death of a child, a baby. And obviously from the title we can tell that it's Anne Bradstreet's grandchild, Elizabeth Bradstreet. So we have that. Her tone here in this stanza is heartbroken, distraught. We see some alliteration with fair flower in line 3. We have some anaphora, or some repetition, with the farewells in the first 3 lines. And then in line 4, we have kind of what I saw, or what I read as a slant rhyme with eternity. Because eternity in our dialect and our accent here in Ohio is just eternity, but I and eternity doesn't really rhyme together, but I suppose, given that Bradstreet is from England, her accent or the way she intended the poem to be spoken could give it a rhyme or a slant rhyme. Alright, I will keep reading, and then we will talk more. By nature, trees do rot when they are grown, and plums and apples thoroughly ripe do fall. And corn and grass are in their season mown, and time brings down what is both strong and tall. But plants new set to be eradicate, and buds new blown to have so short a date, is by his hand alone that guides nature and fate. So, trying to figure out where we want to go first. Well, the tone of this stanza is leaning more towards, although she is heartbroken and distraught, she does ultimately come to the conclusion that she still accepts that there's a season for everything, and things and lives come and go. There's a circle of life here, is what she's alluding to. Which leads into the theme of the poem that I saw as that even though Bradstreet is grieving, she still accepts ultimately that God's will is sovereign and he is in control of everything, which can possibly bring her peace and comfort, because she put a period on that last line, line 14. So it is a 14-line poem. Rhyme scheme wise is A, B, A, B, C, C, C. So it's kind of similar to a sonnet type with 14 lines, and it starts out with the A, B, A, B rhyme scheme. However, instead of breaking it up into 3 stanzas and ending with a couplet, she's just got 2 stanzas, and the rhyme scheme of the last 3 lines in both stanzas are triplets instead of couplets. And both the 7th line and the 12th line end in periods, as well as line 4 and line 8. So there's a finality there, instead of her ending each or most of her lines with a comma. So the style of this poem is an elegy. She's writing this as an elegy for her grandbaby that passed away. She starts out heartbroken and distraught. However, it sticks with the Puritan theme that even though there's tragedy and there's heartbreak and terrible things in life happen, she still reverences God and understands that he is in control of everything ultimately, and that there's kind of the sense that she accepts that there is a season for everything and a reason for everything that God does. And there's also that sense of that ultimate submission to God. So meter, while we were talking about the structure of the poem, it's primarily iambic pentameter, except as when I counted it out and I read it and did the stresses and unstresses of the poem, the only issue I came across was lines with those periods 7 and 14. I counted 12 syllables. I don't know if hypothetically, in line 7, if settled and everlasting are supposed to be... Let me back up. I don't know if settled is supposed to be read as one syllable in line 7, and if everlasting is supposed to be read as 2 syllables instead of 4. And with 14, I don't know if alone is supposed to be read as 1 syllable and nature is supposed to be read as 1 syllable instead of 2 each. I could be wrong, but the way I read it and counted it in my head multiple times and out loud multiple times to make sure that I was not going crazy is I counted 12 syllables each. Unless I'm not including the accent, possibly, or her dialect in that. So these periods, back to that real quick, with the finality of that. With line 7, "Sith thou art settled in an everlasting state." There's the finality there that Elizabeth Bradstreet is gone, dead, she's in heaven with God, God has her, just as the final line, line 14, is by his hand alone that guides nature and fate. There's that finality that, even though this happened, God is in control. And he deems what is fair and what is right. So, given that... I'm trying to see... Okay. Good. I covered that. Just checking. So... There's some symbolism in here, of course. Maybe some slight personification. So... the trees and the buds. As for trees, I interpreted that as a symbol for humankind in general. By nature, trees do rot when they are grown. Naturally, when we are grown up and we get old, if God doesn't take us first before we grow old by nature, if we do indeed grow old, nature-wise, we will die when we are grown. And then buds, I interpreted it as children and babies. and buds new blown to have so short a date. So here I interpret, and I believe what Bradstreet is saying here is that buds new blown to have so short a date that sometimes babies and children unfortunately do die, and it is by God's hand that he decides what happens and what doesn't happen. So if a baby or a child dies, it's tragic, it's terrible, but God is in control of everything, so there must be a reason for it, and if there is no general reason for it, God has that child and that baby regardless. And for the slight personification, there may be slight personification in line 8, 9, 10, 11, and time brings down what is both strong and tall. There's kind of that human quality of time bringing down those trees that are grown. As time goes on, if God doesn't take us before we grow old, as I said a few minutes ago, time will take us, because we don't live forever. We can't. So back to the iambic pentameter real quick. Apart from the 7th and 14th line, the poem's pretty consistent in that iambic pentameter theme with the da-dum, 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 da-dum rhythm. There's unstressed, stressed for the most part, and then there's 5 feet in each line, except for that 7th and 14th line that I counted. And also, in the 14th line, I saw it and read it as possibly one trochee, which is the opposite of I am, unstressed, stressed. A trochee, if you don't know, is stressed, unstressed. So I read 14 as is by his hand alone that guides nature and fate. It sounds kind of awkward the way I say it, and I could be wrong about that being a trochee, but I kept reading it in different ways, and that's the way that made the most sense to me, so if I'm wrong, please correct me. Line 7, though, however, is still in iambs, except there's not 5 feet, there's 6 feet in that line that I counted. Sith thou art settled in an everlasting state. So again, I could be wrong on that trochee there that I caught at the end, but please let me know if I am. No pun intended. I accidentally just said I am. Rhythm. So I kind of already talked about the rhythm. There's that pretty much consistent da-dum, 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 da-dum throughout the poem. And I did notice some tropes. There's metaphor, of course, of the buds and the trees and nature, representing the circle of life, humankind. There's imagery as well there in that metaphor. There's allusions to God and heaven and being in an everlasting state. That's an allusion to heaven, being with God. By his hand alone, that's an allusion of submission to God. And I noticed an apostrophe, as Dr. Sonstegard mentioned in his lecture video for the week. And I believe the apostrophe in this poem is Elizabeth, because this is an elegy for her that Anne Bradstreet is writing to her and talking to her, but she can't talk back because tragically she is gone, she is dead. And also, I mean, she was a baby anyway. And I think for this poem, that is pretty much everything I caught. I'm sure that some of you may have caught other things that I didn't catch. But if I'm wrong or anything, if you want to let me know if you saw something else that I didn't, or if you caught something else that I didn't, or if you have any other theories about that 7th and 14th line being different, please let me know. Yeah, I feel like 7 and 14 may have been different to kind of represent the finality of each cycle of life or cycle of grieving, maybe. Like the first 7 lines may possibly represent the grief, the tragedy, and then the last 7 may represent beginning to heal and accepting what has happened and accepting that God is in control of everything regardless of any tragedy that happens. And then that last line and line 7 are the ultimate finality of those phases of a tragedy, of the grief, and then the acceptance. So that is all I have for this week. Looking forward to seeing if anyone has any thoughts in the discussion board. Thank you.